About 300 watts is what the 13900K pulls when it's under an all-core workload. Really high. So power numbers have shot up with GPUs and with CPUs alike, and at this point, it just seems like this is what we're committing to as an industry. Now, of course, in gaming, it's not always pulling full power, but for an all-core workload, we can look at it generation to generation and see that, yes, in fact, the 13900K is pulling a lot more power than the old i9s did. But in this review, we're going to be looking at not just power consumption, we'll look at power efficiency. Those are the two biggest things with the new i9, and we're comparing it against the 7950X. We'll be looking at older Intel CPUs and old AMD CPUs alike back to the 1700. And then in our next one, we're gonna look at the 13600K, which is actually a pretty interesting comeback story. This video is brought to you by us and the GN Store. Between the 13900K, the 7950X, and the RTX 4090, our electricity bill is actually, and this isn't even a joke, noticeably higher this month than it was before. The brand new Debug GN Coaster Pack pays for all of our testing costs, whether that's the hands-on staff power or the electrical bill. Head over to store.gamersnexus.net to grab our new Debug coasters, including these 4 unique designs in each pack sold. These include a green RAM coaster, a red and black motherboard with debug code and power and reset buttons, a minimalist GN logo, and an SSD with pins on the side. These are in stock and shipping now on store.gamersnexus.net. So let's get to the basics first. First of all, you're going to hear the word Raptor Lake thrown around a lot. That is because Raptor Lake is the code name for the 13000 series. It means the same thing as saying 13000 series, 13th gen. It's all the same thing. Now, there's 2 of them coming out today for reviews, the 13900K and the 13600K. We have both. We're finishing the 13600K review right now, but they're both going to go live very soon. For pricing and specs and all that stuff, the 13900K we're reviewing right now costs somewhere around $600 to $660 or so, and the KF version without the IGP should be closer to $575. As a reminder, Intel announces the 1K unit pricing, so 1,000 units tray price. We don't know the actual retail price until the review goes live. So we're going to base our numbers based on an assumed range plus or minus 10% from $600 baseline. We saw it on Newegg for like $660. We'll see if that holds. The specs have the 139 at 8 P cores and 16 total threads off of those. It's got 16 E cores, and then the total thread count all combined is 32. That puts it in direct thread competition, at least with the 7950X, but they are structured much differently. For frequencies, the new 13000 series really boosts high, so Intel, a lot of power is going into maintaining this high frequency, where they're marketing a 5.8 gigahertz max turbo or max thermal velocity boost, or TVB. Intel says it does 5.4 gigahertz P-core max turbo. It does 3 gigahertz base for P-cores and 2.2 for E-cores, with a max TDP of 253 watts and a base of 125. Critically, this time, just like with the 12th gen, there's no more tau. There's no boosting window where it'll turn off turbo after 52 or 56 seconds, whatever it was, to reduce the power consumption. Now, the method of operating for the 13900K is pull all of the power all of the time. It certainly makes testing easier. We don't have to worry about weird settings, truncating turbo, or boosting it for far too long, because it's just always pulling the max power that it can, basically. And with regard to what you need to know for those TDP numbers, it's really just the higher one. It's pretty much always going to be pulling that in an all-core workload. But there's an important point here where motherboard auto vCore will dictate the power consumption. So remember that, where in the past we've looked at boards that pull an extra 50 or even 70 watts basically for nothing, because the board manufacturer is running conservatively high for voltage or vCore to the CPU to maintain stability, and as such makes the power numbers look way worse and blast the thermals. We don't have anything to worry about with MCE this time. We're testing with the Intel default guidance on a Z690 Asus Hero board. So these are compatible with Z690. There's Z790 as well. We're not looking at those boards today. And then DDR4 and 5 are both supported with the new Raptor Lake or 13000 series CPUs. Okay, enough of the setup. Now, pricing to pay attention to. Again, 139 is 600 to 660, something like that. We'll see how it shakes up. The KF will perform identically in these charts, except the IGP is not present, and that is a little under 600 in theory. The 7950 is $700 currently today on Amazon. 7900X was a 12 core, is another competitor at $550, so that's the cheaper option. And then total platform cost is something to consider as well, but we'll talk about that more explicitly in our 13600K review. Let's get into the benchmarking. The first set of testing we're gonna do is focusing on power, because that's That's the real story. It's the more power you have, the harder it's gonna be to cool. We're gonna take this thing over to the power testing station and talk about that setup. So for power testing, we do the testing for CPUs at the EPS 12 volt cables, which means that that's not accounting for the entire system power draw. That's a good thing. And it also means it's before the VRM efficiency losses. So there's a little bit of extra power in there depending on how the VRM is performing. But let's take a look at some of the charts. Here's the all-core workload power chart. It's insane. The i9-13900K is running at 295 watts with the Asus Z690 Hero. Individual boards always have a lot of influence over the final power readings, since it'll hinge on things like auto V-core. But in this testing, we ensured it was within the Intel default guidance applied. At 295 watts, the 13900K becomes one of the most difficult CPUs to cool on our charts. It's surpassing the 7950X and its 251 watt all-core. And remember, temperature isn't just some magical number with a C at the end of it that the CPU spits out. It happens because of power, and higher power is harder to cool. So regardless of how the 7950X boosts to 95C, the fact of the matter is the 13900K runs hotter in the purest sense of energy. It likely has become the least efficient CPU we've tested anytime recently as well, and we'll look at those numbers soon. Generationally, here's some context. The 12900K pulled 244 watts in this workload, with a 10900K at 130 watts after tau expiry, which happens in 56 seconds or so, and that's because that's when we still had boost periods, which we no longer do. It's only going up now, and it's starting to get out of control. The 13600K, which isn't on this chart, will tell a different story, but you'll have to check back for that review because we're still finalizing it right now. Now again, this will change a bit depending on the board, so when you have auto V-core, auto VCCSA, or VCCIO, things like that, there's a little bit of flux between the boards where Gigabyte or Asus might configure a more conservatively high voltage value to err on the side of stability. But with that comes unnecessarily high power consumption sometimes. So we wouldn't be surprised if you see a 40 watt delta from board to board where maybe sometimes they're 250 watts, maybe they're 290 watts, depending on how aggressively it's running the V-core. Single core power consumption puts the 13900K at 44 watts. It's still high, but it's better than the 7950X and the 7900X when 100% loaded on one core. The 12900K ran at 41 watts, functionally the same, with the 10900K at 32 watts. We are returning full circle to the days of the FX9590, which pulled 52 watts single core. Let's take a look at power efficiency next. The 5950X is currently the reigning champion on this chart, but again, check back for the 136 because it looks pretty interesting. The 13900K is the reigning loser at 53 watt hours. It's far and away the least efficient CPU we've tested any time recently for all core workloads. It doesn't mean it will be this inefficient in games, but as a general gauge, it just isn't anywhere close to what the other CPUs on the chart can achieve with the same power in something like Blender. The gulf between the 13900K and the 12900K is almost exactly one 5950X wide. That's how big of a gap there is between the efficiency. You could fit another CPU in the gap. The 7950X, despite losing efficiency against the 5950X, when at least both are stock, still puts the 13900K to shame. So what all that means, going back to the gaming section for the test we're gonna run here, gaming on the CPUs, it translates to Intel's probably gonna be at the top of basically all the charts today for gaming, and it's because they're blasting power. At some point, it's brute forcing in the same way as you would with a cooler, where if you're on 60 dBA all the time, sure, congratulations, you're at the top of the chart, but it's without any grace whatsoever, and that's kind of where we are with power efficiency. Let's get into some of the gaming benchmarks, see how it does. Games pull less power than an all-core workload does because it's not all-core all the time. So there's that to remember. But there'll still be some transfer of this behavior, this inefficient behavior overall, and we'll have some games relating to the RTX 4090 scattered throughout as well, because for 3090 Ti testing, most of the time we're fine, we're not really GPU bound, but we were starting to hit GPU constraints, and for those tests, we reran just a couple CPUs, we ran 3 primary ones, we got the 136 in there as well, and that's with the 4090. So let's start with some gaming tests. CSGO is up first. The 13900K doesn't hit the top of the charts in this one. It's close, it's not quite there though. The 7950X leads at 436 FPS average with Intel at 419.9 FPS average. And no, we're not rounding that one up because we won't give you the satisfaction. The lows are also advantaged on the AMD CPU, but not in a way that necessarily matters. There's a wide variance in CSGO low measurements in general, which you can see indicated on the chart. The 13900K improves on the 12900K by about 12%, with improvement over the 10900K, because we're going to pretend the 11th gen doesn't exist, at an actually impressive 55%. Still, AMD remains extremely competitive here, and it's likely that the 13600K will surpass the 13900K in value for gaming. That's normal. Here, though, there's just no value in the 13.9 at the $600 plus mark. 1440p is up next. In this one, we're still CPU bound. That's impressive, actually. The stack remains mostly the same, with the 13900K moving around slightly. This is one of the few games where we aren't running into a GPU limitation with something like a 3090 Ti at 1440p. The conclusion is the same as the 1080p test because of that. Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker's up now, and this one, the 13900K, steamrolls its way to the top of the chart with an impressively high 286 FPS average. Percentage-wise, that gives it an advantage over the second place 12900K's 248 FPS average of about 16%. Not bad for one generation. It's not particularly exciting, but it's better than what Intel used to give us for gains. The lows didn't scale much, so this is primarily a benefit in the average. The closest AMD CPUs are the 7700X and the 7600X, where the 13900K leads the best of AMD by 24%. Rainbow Six Siege is up now. This one runs into the territory of completely absurd FPS, with the 13900K at 635 FPS average, although the lows aren't improving for it. The lead over the 12900K is just 3%, pointing to a likely bottleneck finally at the top end. The AMD CPUs cap at about 607 FPS average in this one, and ultimately these gaps they're not impressive. It does remind us, though, how hardware is currently outpacing popular games for graphics load. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is one of the ones we tested on the 4090, but we'll start with the 3090 Ti charts. In this one, the 13900K ran at 263 FPS average, roughly capped alongside the top AMD CPUs, although markedly outpacing the prior 12900K. Between the top choices, though, there's no difference. We're limited by the GPU. We've only tested 4 CPUs with the 4090 for now, and you're only going to see 3 of them today until the 13600K review, which, again, we're still processing the data for that. Switching to the 4090 unlocks more headroom, getting us to 308 FPS average on the 13.9 and establishing a technical but irrelevant lead over the 7950X. Lows are similar overall, although Intel has an advantage. The 7900X drags behind more notably, allowing the 13900K a lead of 8%. Back to the 3090 Ti. 1440p has us entirely GPU bound. No differences emerge at any point above the 12100F, and even that's running pretty close to everything else. This really gives perspective once again on how to optimize selected your parts to minimize massive bottlenecks. You're always going to have a bottleneck, you just don't want it to be a gigantic disparity. Moving back to the 4090 with 1440p, the 7950X and 13900K have become tied and are bound. The 13900K maintains better lows, technically, and the 7900X has a deficit here against the other two. Far Cry is another one where we ran both GPUs just because we weren't 100% sure which bind we were hitting on these. With the 3090 Ti and at 1080p, the 13900K ran at 196 FPS average, but suffered from a staggering hit to 0.1% lows. This is due to the CPU bouncing off of limitations. It's not handling the scheduling well as it gets tripped up over itself. We've seen this in the past too. When encountering various bottlenecks and testing with frame time consistency, you see that it can go out the window sometimes, and that heavily depends on the game and its engine. GTA and its Rage engine is a popular example of an engine that previously had erratic, spiky, and stuttery behavior when exceeding the engine FPS limit of 187.5. Although they finally fixed that. Anyway, on the chart, the 13900K leads the 5800X3D, AMD's top CPU here, by 8.3%. It next leads the 12900K and the 7950X, with the latter struggling with lows as well, and that lead is about 12% for the 13.9. Here's the Frametime Chart. This is the most empirical look at frame-to-frame experience that we can drill down to, showing time in milliseconds between presents. The 7950X had a similar behavioral pattern that we discussed in its review, and you can see that pattern plotting here. It had occasional spikes to 20 to 23 milliseconds from a baseline of about 5 or so. The Intel i9-13900K did similar, spiking from about 4 to 5 milliseconds per frame to the occasional 20 to 25 millisecond hit. Those are what dragged down that averaging seen in the 0.1% lows. With the RTX 4090, we don't really see much additional scaling, so we were already relatively unbound in this regard, and it may be cache or memory limiting us more. We'd have to dedicate time to research this specific game, and since it's not one people care much about, honestly, we won't. It's just not a good use of our time right now. but there is a bind nonetheless, and it's not really the GPU in the same way it might be in other games. Either way, we've unbound the frame time lock, at least on the 13900K, which runs a lot healthier now, holding a higher set of lows, as does the 7950X, and then it's at 200 FPS average. The 7900X is 175. For Cyberpunk, we've only run the 4090 at this point for CPUs. This one shows good scaling for Intel, plotting 263 FPS average and leading the 7950X by about 15%. The 7900X isn't too far back from that mark. Lows overall are proportional to the average for all CPUs present. Enough of the gaming test, let's get into production applications. This is where the i9s make more sense than typically, because normally we say if you're only gaming, you start looking at things like i7s, i5s, unless you're really an FPS snob, frame rate that is, not first-person shooter, and although one and the same at this point, and you really need the max FPS in something like Rainbow Six. But for production, it's a different story, because that's where people tend to actually get bound up on time. Our production benchmark suite starts with Blender, where we time the completion of an in-house render designed for a balanced CPU load. Lower is better. The i9-13900K lands in second place on the chart, completing the render in 6.6 minutes and flanked by the top two Ryzen 7000 CPUs. The $700 Ryzen 7950X is ahead by 9% with its equivalent 32 thread count, but it has a traditional homogeneous core design with 2 threads each, versus the 13900K's more disparate layout where the 16E cores lack hyper-threading. So that 9% bump on the 7950X, that would cost you about $100 more. Probably not worth it, unless you absolutely need CPU rendering speed specifically, and it's the root cause of slowdowns in your daily work if you're doing this for work. And a lot of the times you'll combine other components in here as well, like some GPU rendering with the CPU, especially with new versions of Blender. Compared to the 12-core 7900X, the 13900K reduces time required to render by 18%. Although the 7900X's $550 price point may make it more accessible. We'll see how it shakes out because we're writing the review before launch, so we won't firmly know the retail price of the 139 until this video actually goes live, unfortunately. Generationally for Intel, the 13900K is looking actually pretty good here. It completes the work in 28% less time than the 12900K and an impressive 61% less time than the 10900K, which is starting to show its age. And no, the 11th gen still doesn't exist. 11th gen CPUs aren't real. Our next benchmark is for programmers in the audience, as it measures the time it takes to complete a compile of Chromium in Windows. Since this is time, lower is again better. The 13900K takes the top spot on our chart, which completed the job in 35.7 minutes and required 5% less time than the 7950X. The advantage over the 7900X, the not 50 version, is 23% time reduced. Like we said earlier, the 13900K is kind of brute forcing its way through all-core work and consuming a lot of power in the process. So while this is the fastest on the chart on a technicality against the 7950X, it's also the least efficient. Of course, that won't matter to people who are purely focused on performance and really just want the work done fast, although you'd have future HEDT CPUs to consider as well. The scaling with the 12th gen is similar here compared to Blender, as the 13900K is 30% faster or less time to complete than the 12900K. The extra frequency and E-cores are really putting in the work here. If you've been hanging on to one of these, like a Ryzen 1000 or 2000 production system for years now, and it's noticeably slowing down your work at this point, it's probably wise to start shopping for an upgrade. The 13900K tears through Chromium in 77% less time than the Ryzen 1700 from 2017, which is on par now with an i3-12100F, a quad-core that sells for about $100. For file compression testing, we use 7-Zip's benchmark, where the score is measured in millions of instructions per second, or MIPS. Higher is better. AMD and Intel tie for the top spot, with the 7950X and 13900K performing within 1% of each other. But a hierarchy is quickly established as we move down the chart, with the 13900K outperforming the 7900X by 17%. The new 13900K represents a better value among other top-end processors here, especially considering that you have the option to use Z690 boards and, if you want, DDR4. The best last-gen CPU from AMD, or AM4, for multi-threaded work would be the 5950X, and that is beaten by a healthy 37% advantage on the 13900K. Intel's last gen 12900K performs about the same as that, so that allows a slightly wider 39% margin to the 13900K. The older i9-10900K just can't compete with the current generation here. It's getting blown out with a 127% lead on the 139. The 109 follows behind even the i5-12600K here. Switching to decompression, scaling is generally better with more cores, and Zen has an advantage. The 7950X now runs ahead of the 13900K by 19%, rather than tying it like in compression. The slower but higher thread count 5950X has traded places with the 7900X, and the 13900K's lead is much reduced, down to only 6% over the 5950X and 11% over the 7900X. This test just doesn't look as good for the 13900K's value compared to some of the previous tests, and AMD actually does start to look better here. Intel is, however, doing better than its previous generation, outperforming the 12900K by 55% for only 20% more money. That would be a worthwhile upgrade if you were dealing with compressed files all the time and it's part of your daily work, but it feels pretty bad to upgrade just purely generationally. So this is a situation where we'd say evaluate it based on, do you make money on this type of work? Adobe Premiere is next, our best frenemy that we have to deal with every day. This testing calculates an aggregate score representing the performance of CPUs against filters, transforms, effects, render speed, and live scrubbing and playback as rated by Puget. Unfortunately, we don't yet have a test for crashes per hour in the Adobe suite, but that's something that we're working on. It keeps crashing. The differences between the current high-end CPUs aren't as apparent in Premiere, evidenced by the 7950X and 13900K being effectively tied with only about a 2% difference between them. That's further reinforced by the gap reduction between the 139 and the 12900K. The software just doesn't scale well between these particular architectures at this core count. We're at the limit. Users with several generations old PCs should take note though, because we're approaching doubling in performance versus the Ryzen 7 1700. Our final production test is Photoshop, which scored in a similar fashion to Premiere, but its performance relies much less on core and thread count versus the rest of our production tests. The 13900K takes the top spot in our chart, outperforming the 7900X by about 8% and the 7950 by 11%. It's not large differences and not worth factoring in too much, but it's a clear advantage. That said, you're going to want to wait for our 13600K review to consider all of your options. That one did interestingly here, but we're still processing all of its data. The 12900K isn't too far behind, only allowing a 13% advantage to the 13900K, which isn't as pronounced as some of our other production tests. Photoshop's scaling behavior is shown by the 13900K's performance over the 5950X at 37% higher, but obviously at worse power consumption. We make sure to include Photoshop in our test suite just to show that not all software loads on the CPU behave the same way, because they program it differently, and this one's a little different from some of the others. So recapping this then with as many numbers as quickly as possible, this is the least efficient CPU we've tested any time recently. The 9590 is up there for inefficiency as well. Probably that's the least efficient now, but that's like a decade old. It was AMD's worst showing ever. It's sort of. Sorry to offend you. Not really, it was bad. So the 13900K genuinely is extremely inefficient. This is at that edge though where Intel is pushing all the power they can to maintain the highest clocks they can to try and stay at the top of the chart. It's kind of like what AMD did, where the 7950X in gaming, not talking about production all-core workloads, maintains most of its performance with eco mode on. AMD could have shipped stock in eco mode and then allowed a boost up to, with PBO or something, to its actual stock wattage that it pulls. However, AMD, much like Intel here, decided it would rather get the last couple percentage points performance for a lot more power to try and sit at the top of the chart. And we're seeing the same between both these companies, where at the expense of power and efficiency and your cooler choice, they are pushing as much as they can into it to maintain the most performance. How that ends up in the results though, so just to quickly recap, in CSGO and gaming, we saw the 7950X was 4% faster than the 13900K. The 13900K was 12% faster than the 12900K, but CSGO wasn't particularly representative of the rest of the games we looked at. For other ones, in Final Fantasy XIV, the 139 was 16% faster than the 12900K, and it was 24% faster than the 7700X, which is about the same as the 7950X in that one. In Rainbow Six, 13900K was 3% faster than the 129, likely a bottleneck here. And then in Tomb Raider, the 13900K and the 7950X were almost tied. You start looking around at more extreme examples like Cyberpunk 2077, which we just tested with the 4090s, and that had us at about a 15% lead on the 13.9 over the 7950X. So that's kind of sort of the higher end of what you can expect with that 124% number from earlier over the 7700X, and Final Fantasy being another extreme example. But that gives you an idea that for those in production, we saw somewhere around like high 20s to 30% advantage on the 13900K over the 12900K. Just as a reminder, you probably should not be upgrading if you're on Alder Lake. If you're on a 12,000 series CPU, even though this is sometimes like 30% faster in production workloads, the vast majority of people, unless you're really constrained on how much money you can make with your job, probably shouldn't be upgrading from 12 to 13 today. It feels kind of wasteful. If you don't feel that way, you want to build project, you've got extra money, definitely go for it. But just for the vast majority of people, don't get too caught up in the gains here, because you probably won't notice most of it, but you will notice that financial difference. And that money could be spent on something else, even outside of computers. But within computers, maybe a GPU. Compared to the 7900X or 7950X, we're anywhere from 5 to 19% or so differences in a lot of the production benchmarks. So not too different from gaming, but sometimes there's more of an advantage for AMD than there was in the gaming tests. Now, we don't have the 13600K review finalized. We're still processing some of the numbers right now and writing that review and filming it. But what we will tell you is, from what I've personally looked at so far for that review, you need to check back for it. That one is a lot more interesting. So the flagship Halo products like this one, 13.9, 7950X, they're interesting because they get eyeballs on them. But the lower end products really tend to steal the show in terms of actual value, because they're not trying to cram everything into it just to try and hit the top of a chart. They're going for a more realistic approach. 13.6 is actually incredibly interesting, and that's one we're a little more, so far, positive on. But like I said, we're finalizing that review. Hopefully it'll be up today. Got a few more charts to run though. So for the 13.9 at $600 to $660, the value is pretty rough. It does actually produce gains generationally. Intel struggled for like a decade to produce any gains because everything was 4 cores always, but they've got gains here. The biggest reason for that though is sucking 300 watts out of the power supply to sustain an all-core workload. And that means anytime you're planning to be running this thing under all-core workload sustained, so that's not gaming, you probably are going to want, one, you'll want to make sure your power supply is now large enough to manage full core workload on the CPU, plus a heavy GPU load. If you're in the 40 series or something, that probably pushes your power supply capacity up, so you need to buy up for that. You need to make sure you can soak transients if you're on the 30 series especially, plus this. And then finally, the cooler choice is impacted if you are running those all-core workloads for extended periods of time. This is basically liquid cooler territory for AIOs at least. You can run air coolers with these, but at 300 watts, it's getting pretty close to the limit of what most of the really good air coolers can do while being a reasonable price. So that's the biggest thing outside of the CPU itself to pay attention to. And then of course, motherboard, you've got a lot of options because it's backwards compatible. So that's it for this one. Check back for the 13600K. Power consumption is absolutely insane right now on basically everything. Industry's gone through a cycle, and I guess it's for competitive reasons. They're just trying to all beat each other, and this is the way they're doing it. So thanks for watching. Subscribe for more, and head over to store.gamersnexus.net to grab a pack of our brand new coasters we just launched. These are awesome, and they've been flying off the shelves, so hopefully they're still in stock when the video goes up. Thank you for your support, and check back for the next one. We'll see you all next time.